Hi everyone, Dan here. This episode is going to be different than usual. For a start, I've had to script this bit, so I hope it doesn't sound too forced. Before I explain why I'm doing this, here's a clip from the first podcast Howard and I ever recorded. If you've listened to us since the Cushing Podcast or have explored our YouTube channel, you might have heard this before, but it's the first time this clip has gone out on this podcast feed. This is from 2016. I think it's nice if we think of people we'd like to dedicate the podcast to, and for the first episode I would like to dedicate it to my sister Maureen, who frankly put me on the train that has brought me here by introducing me to old horror movies when I was probably old enough to be ashamed of being scared. I think I was about 14 when she made me watch Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. That was pretty much my first horror movie, and one which has a very special place in my heart. That was the first of many times I've mentioned Maureen across our podcasts and videos. Well, a few days ago, Maureen died in Spain, where she's been living for a few months every year, and where she'd been stuck since the pandemic hit. She was only in her mid-60s. It wasn't exactly sudden. She'd been ill for a little while, but 3 months ago she was fine, and it was a week ago that we got the news of how serious things really were. Of course everyone in my family, are utterly shocked, shattered, and heartbroken, and I don't really know how to process it. That's my problem, of course, and this isn't the place to eulogize her. You didn't know her, unless you're one of my close friends or family friends listening. But I felt like I had to acknowledge her passing here. Not only did Maureen set me on the journey into horror on which I found myself, not only did she encourage me and support me in so many creative pursuits over the years, but the continuance of that journey will now ring with memories of time spent with Maureen, talking and laughing over the fun of it all. Memories like the two of us looking through Jonathan Rigby's book, English Gothic, and pausing to laugh at a particularly pre-epic picture of the actor, Darren Nesbitt, or chuckling about the music of Amicus composer Michael Dress, or the name of an out-of-the-unknown bit-part actor called Laidlaw Dorling. In a way, by carrying on the fun in the form of this podcast, I hope we'll be doing something to keep Maureen's spirit alive. Despite the sad news, Kirsty, Stella, Ian and I did go ahead and record a normal episode this week, a rather wonderful chat about Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I can't wait to share with you. However, I haven't had the time or the energy, to be honest, to give it the post-production it deserves. And so instead, I'm going to present a few highlights from the Cushing Podcast that haven't yet made it to this podcast feed. Howard and I used to have a segment called The Bag of Death, in which we'd take a bag containing the titles of all the British horror films we'd both seen, pick out a film at random, and then air our off-the-cuff musings about it. There are 4 examples here, originally recorded for our episodes about The Curse of Frankenstein, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Scream and Scream Again, and The Hound of the Baskervilles. These are followed by a little bit of previously unheard material that Howard and I recorded for a feature that we later abandoned due to a poor quality recording. I've managed to improve the sound quality a bit, but it still isn't great. But it does feature some material recorded at Tabarca, a small island just off the shore of Santa Pola in Spain, where Maureen used to live, so it seemed appropriate to give it an airing now. Listening back to it, I was sad that I never actually invited Maureen to record a contribution to the podcast, but I also suspect that she would have found the idea somewhat horrifying, and I always hoped our show would be something that entertained rather than embarrassed her. Anyway, here they are. Bags and bags and bags of death.
now the podcast starts.
The Bag of Death.
So, the Bag of Death is a part of the podcast which we've ripped off rather affectionately from a randomly themed Doctor Who podcast called The Memory Cheats, in which every episode they choose a different episode at random and speak of it. The Bag of Death is filled with the titles of horror films. We will plunge a hand into it, and we do not know what will emerge. So, Howard, please produce this.
What have we got? This is genuinely exciting. I don't know what's going to be. The Ghoul!
The Ghoul! Superb.
Oh, I'm glad you picked The Ghoul.
1974 is The Ghoul, a Tyburn production directed by Freddie Francis. Tyburn was a company started by Freddie Francis' son Kevin, whose aim was to recreate the style of the glory days of Hammer, because by the early to mid 70s, Hammer was on the wane, really, and its style was going out of fashion. Whether Tyburn's films really captured the quality of Hammer is up for debate. What do we think about The Ghoul?
Well, I have a soft spot for The Ghoul. It's not as good as a Hammer film, a classic Hammer film, but I like it simply because it's one of the very first horror films I saw, and back in the very early 80s, BBC Two began showing horror double bills every, I think, Saturday night. And the first double bill, and it was actually on the front cover of the Radio Times, which is what was particularly exciting. That's how important horror films were back in those days. And it was Night of the Demon, which we may talk about on another occasion, and The Ghoul. And there was a really terrible picture of Peter Cushing that looked nothing like Peter Cushing on the front cover of the Radio Times. And so we at school were all very excited about this, because we all loved horror films. I think we all enjoyed it. I think we were all a little bit disappointed by the Ghoul himself when he was finally revealed at the end. I won't spoil it too much. There is a ghoul in it. And this was when Peter Cushing was sort of, after his wife tragically had died, so he was not in a particularly good place, perhaps emotionally, and he was just sort of...
And he plays a lonely man mourning the loss of his wife, doesn't he? He holds dear a photograph of his wife in a frame, which is actually a photograph of Peter Cushing's real wife, Helen.
Yes.
And the scene where he picks it up and starts talking about his memories of her is really quite wrenching emotionally.
It is. It's almost too kind of emotionally affecting to be in the film. The film can't quite support that sort of... The film is a fairly sort of standard horror film about people being murdered. It's sort of a bit like Psycho, actually. It's got the plot of Psycho, in a sense.
Well, yes, I keep mentioning critics that Dave Golder in SFX magazine rather wonderfully summed up The Ghoul as being a little bit predictable, and that the title gave away what was going on. He said, "It's as if Psycho had been called Knife-Wielding Cross-Dresser."
That's interesting. But it's, I always say, if you like that sort of thing, if you like that sort of film, I think it's very well done.
Yeah.
John Hurt's in it as a sort of crazed gardener.
Yeah, we should say that when we say it's similar to Psycho, it has its innocent characters through a series of plot developments, which I can't really remember, find their way at this old creepy house in which Peter Cushing lives, and there's something nasty elsewhere in the house. And various characters are killed.
Yes, a character's killed that you might not think is going to be killed. Sort of like...
And it does have quite a nice cast, as you say. John Hurt, a very young John Hurt, as the groundskeeper, is an interesting presence, and also Stuart Bevan and Alexandra Bastido from the TV series The Champions, which was big in the late 60s.
Yes, and Gwen Watford, who's in Taste Blood of Dracula as well.
Of
so there's a certain Hammer element to it, definitely. I mean, a lot of Hammer people are involved. It's just not quite... It just, again, looks a little bit low budget, a little bit sort of reduced.
It's a bit staid for the time as well, yes. I think, isn't it? I think it's one for the fans. If you like Cushing and you like the Hammer mode, you'll probably be quite intrigued to watch The Ghoul. I
have a soft spot for it, mainly because it was on so often when I was very young, and I watched it a lot, and it was always a film I enjoyed then. There's a companion piece called Legend of the Werewolf, which is another film made by the same studio around about the same time. Again, it's sort of trying to appropriate the Hammer style, not quite lacking the resources to do it properly, lacking the grandeur of the Hammer films and the professionalism in a way. They do look a little bit sort of...
I think the most interesting thing about The Ghoul isn't it set in the late 1920s?
Yes.
And you get the feeling that if Hammer had done it in their glory days, they probably would have created something of the 1920s in a quite opulent way. Whereas in The Ghoul, it's more or less down to a nice car, isn't it?
Yes, there's a...
it's a very, very nice car.
Yeah, there's two nice cars.
Yeah.
I mean, I admire them for trying to keep that tradition going at a time when it was unfashionable, at a time when it came out more or less the same time as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that's the way horror's going in the 70s. And they're still trying to make something a little bit more romantic, a little bit more old-fashioned, a little bit more sort of in the traditional style. And I enjoy it. I think it's a little bit slow, but... I think it's entertaining.
Got it on tape somewhere, I think. Maybe I should seek it out. But
it's not available on DVD.
Oh,
the producer's not allowed it to be released. That's something.
Right.
It's on that thing with Tube and You in the title, on this newfangled internet thing.
Is it really? Well, I do think it's worth checking out because I do remember Cushing's performance being particularly strong. They always are, but this one's particularly near the knuckle. And moving for that reason.
Yes, it is. His performance is very moving.
There's an extraordinary, explosive moment near the end, which I won't say anything more about. But yeah, I think in summary, points for effort and strong Cushing performance for me.
The Bag of Death.
And here it is. The Bag of Death, which this time we have audio to support the fact that it's the Bag of Death. That's production values, folks. So this is the part of the show where we have a bag filled with the names of various British horror movies that both I and Howard have seen over the years, but maybe not so recently, maybe fairly recently. And Howard will pick one at random.
I will pick one at random.
We hope that it's good so that we can talk about it.
As in the FA Cup, I will give it a good mixed round. Can you hear that? And I'll pick one from the bottom there. I think I'm picking something. Right, and it's Lust for a Vampire.
Oh my heavens.
Lust for a Vampire.
Another one which I think will be seen on the Horror Channel sometime soon. Well, strange love, Howard. Strange love.
It was made in about 1970 when Hammer was sort of, I think, slightly faltering a little bit. Some of the films they were making at the time, like Horror of Frankenstein, were not so great, and they'd done so many Frankenstein films, so many Dracula films by that stage that they were sort of, I think, becoming a little bit repeating themselves and perhaps a little bit stale. And although they made some great films at that time, like Blood from the Mummy's Tomb and stuff like that, and Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, some of them were not so...
They were a little later.
They were a little bit later. This one is sort of like... And it's weird because it's directed by Jimmy Sangster, who wrote all the classic early Hammer films, Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Mummy. But somehow it's just not very... It doesn't really do it for me.
Well, although Jimmy Sangster did direct some other films, some of which might be good. I'm thinking in particular... What's the... Is it Fear in the Night?
Fear in the Night, yes.
I think that's quite respectable. I've never seen it. Horror of Frankenstein, though, the spoof remake of Frankenstein, which we talked about last time, is not supposed to be very good.
It's not very good.
But although he wrote that, he did not write Lust for a Vampire. But I get the impression that there's just not a lot of interest in what's going on from the director. We should explain that because Hammer's horror output was faltering a little bit, we're moving into the era now where their most successful films, possibly the most successful British films going for a couple of years, were things like the On the Buses films, which were Hammer productions. The horror market was petering out a little bit, and Hammer were looking for ways to reinvigorate it. One of the things they tried was to bring in new stars, a new generation of horror stars, so we had people like Ralph Bates, who was introduced as the new Baron Frankenstein in the Horror of Frankenstein, and is also the star of this film. But they didn't really take off, although I think Ralph Bates is rather good.
He is good. Peter Cushing was intended to play that part.
In which one?
In Lust for a Vampire.
Oh, okay.
Because I remember seeing there's a picture of him in the costume, in
right.
the pince-nez glasses that Ralph Bates wears. So I think he was the first choice. He couldn't do it for whatever reason. Maybe this was when his wife was ill, so he couldn't do it. So Ralph Bates took over. Yeah, it's sort of... I just don't...
Well, the weird thing is that although they were setting him up as a new young star, He is playing the Cushing role in this, the elderly Cushing role. He's the kind of old fuddy-duddy guy in it, isn't he? Another thing they tried to do was engage new producers, and there were 2 independent producers with amazing names. In fact, there were 3 guys with amazing names in this production. The producers are called Harry Fine and Michael Style. How the hell that happened? And they worked with a screenwriter with an even more amazing name called Tudor Gates.
Tudor Gates, yes.
Who, for a long time, I think was like president of the Writers' Guild of Great Britain or something. And they came to Hammer with the idea of adapting Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which was one of the early great pieces of vampire literature, pre-Dracula, and has lesbian overtones to it, which they brought out rather vividly in the first film that they made, which was 1969-70s, The Vampire Lovers, directed by Roy Ward Baker, which has Cushing and Douglas Wilmer, but most importantly has Ingrid Pitt as Carmilla.
George Cole.
And George Cole. And that was very successful, relatively speaking, and did have these kind of explicit lesbian sex scenes in it and nudity and things. Madeline Smith taking her clothes off and stuff. So Hammer kind of went, whoa, that works, more of that please. So they engaged Fine and Style to make Lust for a Vampire, which was a sequel essentially to The Vampire Lovers. Jimmy Sangster came on board to direct it, but obviously didn't have a very good time doing it and didn't seem very interested in it. The film itself is one of Hammer's great disasters, I think. There are things in it. Well, me and my friend Brendan went through a proper Hammer. I mean, I've always been in a Hammer phase. I'm never out of a Hammer phase. He'd come round to my house for coffee fairly regularly. We were school friends and we remained mates. We got to a phase where we'd always watch Hammer films, and he'd say, "Can we watch something with Christopher Lee in?" Unfortunately, one week I didn't have Christopher Lee. I just had Lust for a Vampire, and I just remember some of the production values being so rubbish that they really inspired us. They're just so funny. And in fact, there's a moment in the film where a character falls to his death down a well. I don't know if you remember this.
Yes, I do.
And it's funny that we were just talking on the Curse of Frankenstein last time about how well the death of Professor Waldman was achieved with the stuntman actually throwing himself through a balustrade and hitting the ground. Well, they didn't do that on this one. They just threw a dummy down a well and then dubbed a scream onto it. And the wonderful thing about the dummy is, it's obviously a dummy. It doesn't move or react in any way at all. And halfway down the well, it smashes into the side of the well head first. And like, it doesn't break in half, but it's clearly a killing blow. If you smash your head into anything like that, you're dead. But instead of cutting the scream off when it smashes, they had the scream do a reaction. So it's kind of like, and that's just one of my favourite dub screams ever. And I've been asked to recreate that on various things more than once. And recently did it on an animated project, which I hope will come out soon. And I hope sounds half as wonderful as the one on Lust for a Vampire. Another thing we should say is that the character of Carmilla was killed at the end of The Vampire Lovers, but she's resurrected, being a vampire. She's resurrected in Lust for a Vampire, and there are kind of cultish characters who help to resurrect her and then do her bidding. And one of them is played by Mike Raven, who I believe was another radio DJ. There's themes in this episode which are coming up, which I'm rather pleased with. He was like not Radio 1. I'm not sure if there was Radio 1 at the time. I
don't know too much about him. I've sort of tried to find out about him. He was in a few horror films at that stage, mainly because he had like a very sinister-looking goatee beard.
Yeah.
He was dubbed a couple of times in some of the films.
He was dubbed in this one. Basically, he wasn't an actor. He couldn't act. He did have a nice beard, and that's it. He's in I, Monster, which is a Christopher Lee Peter Cushing film, so we'll talk about that later on. But in this one, he plays like the big villain. But he just had... He had nothing. He had no presence. They obviously knew that. Jimmy Sangster obviously knew that. So they dubbed him with Valentine Dial, who is one of the best voices that any human being can ever have. And I can't do it, because nobody can. And they even edited in close-ups of his eyes, extreme close-ups of his eyes, so that you wouldn't have to look at his expressionless face. And they're not even his eyes. They're Christopher Lee's eyes from one of the later Dracula films. So, they obviously knew that they were on hiding to nothing with this. There was also a problem that Ingrid Pitt, who'd originally played Carmilla, wasn't coming back. I don't know why. So they hired a Swedish actress called Jutta Stensgaard, who has a very interesting chin.
Yes. Is this the film where Jutta Stensgaard portrays somebody having an orgasm by crossing her eyes?
Yes, that's the one.
This is that film, yes.
That's what I mean when I say strange love, because we have in that sex
That's the
scene,
song, isn't it?
which is with Ralph Bates, has a terrible early 70s pop song played over it called Strange Love, and you kind of imagine that the moment when he saw that in the edit suite was the moment when Jimmy Sangster went, I've had enough of this, because he did walk off the production, I think.
I don't know. I just watched it not that long ago, and I just thought this film has no atmosphere. The cast is unengaging. Nobody's really bothered about it. The story just doesn't seem to go anywhere. The production values are not high. It's just so bland. It's just so kind of. There's nothing to it. There's no substance to this film at all.
Considering that we go on about the music quite a lot in this podcast, there's not even a good musical score. The score is by a guy called Harry Robinson, and again it's really bland. And he can be really good, but it just isn't. There's just nothing there.
Everything is bland. Everything is bland about it.
Oh no!
It's just like nobody's bothered. It's just like they're all going through the motions. They've got to make this film, so they're doing it. But there's the energy and the passion that was in the early Hammer films just isn't there at all. It's just, and also it's just the sex. It's all about the sex. They've realised that sex sells at that time.
The irony, though, was that although sex sells in Britain, in America, the Hammer films were aimed at children. They were considered like childish fantasies. So they would cut out the extreme bits and market them at kids. So obviously they had to cut out all the sex and all the nudity and rendered the films incomprehensible by this point because they were all sex and nudity. It was all there was.
Yeah.
So Hammer was just cutting itself out of a whole market by doing that, really. This is the peril of the Bag of Death. We never know what's going to come out of the Bag of Death. And it might not be something very good and we might not be able to be very positive about it. What I will say, to reverse that tone slightly, is that you'd come out of that movie never wanting to watch another film produced by Harry Fine and Michael Style and written by Tudor Gates, ever. But they did do a third Karnstein movie, which is a prequel to the other two, called Twins of Evil, just a year later, or 2 years later. Basically, the whole creative team, Fine, Style and Harry Robinson and Tudor Gates, they're all back, but it's got Peter Cushing and a good director, John Hoff, and it's absolutely cracking. I love that one, and I love the theme music, and I hope we'll play that in James Bernard's jukebox at some point. So don't watch Lust for a Vampire, even if it's on the horror channel. Wait for Twins of Evil.
Lust for a Vampire is interesting in what it says about Hammer at the time. Kind of like the way Hammer was changing and what kind of audience it was trying to appeal to, and sort of having a bit of an identity crisis at that time. Because a lot of Night of the Living Dead had come out at that stage, and Witchfinder General had come out. So does Hammer keep on doing what it's always done, or does it try to change, to adapt to a new audience, which wants more sex and which wants more violence? I think it's an interesting film because it doesn't quite know what it wants to be. Hammer doesn't quite know what it wants to be at that stage, I think.
Yes, and they did become more confident and they got a bit more.
But there's a lot of very good Hammer films made after that.
Yes. It's a transitional point.
It's when they're trying to do a traditional Hammer vampire movie, but doing it in a new way, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
If you're going to do something in a new way, you have to have a new idea, like Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. It's a completely different take on the Mummy film, because it doesn't have a mummy in it, and it works. Lust for a Vampire is caught between being a traditional Hammer vampire film and trying to be something different. But also, I just say thought it was very, the script is just very banal, and it's just not a very good film anyway.
Well, alas. But yes, but Twins of Evil is very good.
The Bag of Death.
So here we are, we have the Bag of Death, and Howard is going to take the Bag of Death from me.
I'm going to give my bag a really good shake. You can hear that?
In the Bag of Death is a collection of British horror films which we've both seen, and we never know which one will be produced
never know, there's a lot in here. Let's have this one. Oh, hang on. F. And it's Quatermass 2.
Quatermass 2!
Quatermass 2.
Wow. You know, I was almost tempted to use the music for Quatermass 2 as this week's James Bernard's Jukebox, but I didn't because I thought it was bound to come up some other time. And great. Quatermass 2 starring...
Brian Donlevy.
Well, I was going to kind of take it backwards and go starring Vera Day and Sidney James and John Longdon and William Franklin. Oh, and Brian Donlevy.
And Michael Ripper.
So just to recap on what this movie is, we might have to cover some of the stuff we'd mentioned in the first podcast here. Hammer's first kind of successful horror/sci-fi movie that kind of really put them on the map was the Quatermass Experiment in 1955. That was based on a TV series which had been on the BBC in 1953. The movie was a huge hit. Hammer was not a name in itself when that movie was made. They brought in an Irish-American actor, who was a name in Hollywood, to play the lead for that reason, to kind of bolster their international chances. So they brought in an actor called Brian Donlevy. Unfortunately, the film, even though they did that, the film was not a huge hit in America. It was a massive hit in Britain because of its association with the Quatermass TV series, which was so well known. Hammer wanted to build on that success, so they immediately wanted to basically make a sequel, but Nigel Neal, the creator and writer, wouldn't let them. He wouldn't let them just make up their own Quatermass movie. So they hired Jimmy Sangster to write a film called X the Unknown, which is basically a Quatermass film without Quatermass in it. And that was also a very successful film in Britain. And by the time that was made, there had been a TV sequel to Quatermass, which was broadcast in 1955, called Quatermass 2. So, as a result of that, the movie was then made in 1957, I think. So it's the same year that The Curse of Frankenstein came out. And it's remarkable in loads of ways. One of the ways in which it is remarkable is I think it's the first ever film sequel to be called Something 2.
I think it is.
It created a convention in movie making there that I deeply love and miss, because everything now it's not Something 2, it's something else. It's The Hunger Games Catching Fire, something like that. But this is unusual as well. The film has a reason for being called Quatermass 2, because a large plot device in it and in the TV series is the rocket that Quatermass has made, which is called the Quatermass 2 rocket. The character created by Nigel Neal, Professor Quatermass, is the head of the British rocket group. He's basically the guy in charge of the British space program. In the Quatermass Experiment, he's launched an orbital rocket which comes back to Earth with something nasty on it. And in Quatermass 2, he's trying to continue his work, but being frustrated by bureaucrats and things. He really wants to create a program which will launch several rockets to the moon and create a base on the moon, which has been designed. But at the start of the movie, he's kind of between projects, and he gets drawn into a mystery about unknown meteorites that are falling on a village, an English village called Winnerton Flats. And when he goes to investigate that town, he finds that there's a large secret scientific base there, which resembles the kind of thing he would have liked to build on the moon. It's got huge kind of atmospheric pressure domes, as Brian Donlevy says. Looking into where this has come from, he finds that it has been created by a conspiracy in the British government, which involves alien beings. Things get darker, not lighter, from there, really. What do you think about Quatermass 2?
I think it's terrific. I think it's a very, very effective, very atmospheric. It's a very atmospheric film, quite intense political thriller. I mean, we talk about Scream and Scream Again having a political element, being like a conspiracy thriller. This also is, but I think it's a much more effective one because of the understated way it's done. And it's very powerful. And the idea that sort of people in the government are aliens in disguise, or they've been possessed, haven't they, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, that they are aliens is actually quite 1957. Is actually quite provocative and quite powerful. I think it's interesting because this, as you say, this came out the same year as Curse of Frankenstein, and they're totally different.
Yes,
this
absolutely.
is a black and white, understated film set in the present day.
It's got very murky but beautiful black and white photography by Gerald Gibbs.
It looks amazing. Whereas Curse of Frankenstein is colour, lurid, melodramatic, theatrical kind of film. They're two very different kinds of films, and I suppose Hammer could have gone either way, because both those films were successful. As it was, Curse of Frankenstein was more successful, so they decided to go down the colour, sort of gothic route, and do all the classic monsters, rather than the understated black and white sci-fi route. I
think The Curse of Frankenstein was successful around the world, whereas films like Quatermass were only successful at home. All the Quatermass films bombed in America.
But they are brilliant films.
Yeah.
They're both brilliant films, and they both work. And Hammer do them extremely well.
Yes,
it's just
absolutely.
that The Curse of Frankenstein was more successful than... And it would be interesting if maybe Quatermass 2 had been successful, whether they would have made more films like that, or if Quatermass Experiment had been more successful, they would have gone...
Yeah,
They did do some
I wish-
psychological thrillers which were black and white, so they did make other black and white films, but Hammer was associated with colour, and
Yeah.
with sort of like technical and very sort of lurid, gaudy colour kind of...
No, there are other kind of mysterious black and white British sci-fi movies that were made later that are kind of associated with the tradition of Quatermass. Films like Village of the Damned,
Unearthly Stranger, the Night
Yes.
Caller.
John Crish's The Night Caller, I think that is. That's very good. But apart from the Hammer film, The Damned, which we've just been talking about, none of these movies are actually Hammer films. And the later Quatermass and the Pit film is a Hammer film, but it's in colour and things. It doesn't really feel related
No,
to...
Quatermass and the Pit is much more like the established Hammer horror style
Yeah.
of filmmaking.
I mean, it's not a gothic horror film, but
But it's got the same sort of look
yeah.
as it, and the same sort of quality.
But no, Quatermass 2 is a terrific film. It's lean and exciting and mysterious, I think.
Yes. And I also want to say, because I know a lot of people criticise Brian Donlevy and say he's miscast, he's not very good. For me, it works. For me, his performance is perfectly fine. It's a very dour and humorless performance, and there's not a lot of light relief in it. But in the context of the film, I think it worked. And he was a great actor. He worked with Preston Sturges in The Great McGinty, and he's in a classic film noir called The Glass Key, and he's in quite a few westerns. So he's a very good actor. It's not like he's a bad actor playing the part. He's a very good actor who perhaps is slightly out of his comfort zone here. But I think it works. When I watch it again, the performance doesn't bother me as much as it seems to bother other people. I think it's right for the film.
Well, the
He's
thing
that sort of
about
character.
thing about Professor Quatermass, he's not a guy in the crowd. He's not the guy next door. He's not an everyday person. He is a highly intellectual guy, a kind of not anti-establishment, but individualistic.
Well, he's obstinate, and
scientist.
he's stubborn, and he's bullish, and he's, and Don Levy conveys that.
Yeah, I think that there is, in Neil's original character, there is a gentleness to him as well, which isn't there in Don Levy's performance, but neither is it there in the script.
No, it's not in the script. That's the thing.
Of the Quatermass Experiment, he's non-gentle and he's actually quite harsh in a lot of ways. And even at the end of the film, he doesn't seem to show any remorse for what's happened and the disaster about what happened to this astronaut who's on his rocket, and he says, "Well, I'll just build another rocket." That's the end of the film. I don't think Nigel Kneale would have done that or liked it, and in the sequel, there is a softer edge to the character and more attempt to show him as a human being who cares about other human beings. But it's not the strongest aspect of the film.
I think he plays the part that he's given to play. I think that's the character that's the character that Val Guest has intended for the film, rather than Nigel Kneale has intended. That's I know lots of British films had American stars in those days.
And I think it's pretty well directed by Val Guest.
I think it's very well directed.
He was a good documentary style director who shot great natural looking stuff on locations. There's a terrific Hammer film that we'll never talk about in depth in this podcast because it's not a horror or even a sci-fi type film. It's a police thriller called Hell is a City, much of it filmed on location in Manchester by Val Guest, and it looks terrific and it feels like life, and I think he brings that to Quatermass as well.
Yes. Oh yeah. It's very understated. It's very sort of like powerful. Also, the first film it's kind of like the show is completely stolen by an actor called Richard Wordsworth playing the infected alien, and so all the other characters are sort of he's the one that compels the audience's attention, whereas in this film there isn't that sort of. Don Levy is much more the focus of the film.
Yeah,
but there's lots of good actors in this. I mean, there's Sid James, of course, who's always welcome. And appeared in, I think, every single British film made in the 1950s.
He's... I've never seen it, but there's a film which is like a gangster version of Macbeth.
Joe Macbeth.
Yeah. And he plays the banquet character in it, who's called Banky.
He's great. There's a guy called Percy Herbert, who was in lots of war films. He's in it. Vera Day, who was a starlet of the time. John Van Eysen, who's in Dracula. The Hammer Dracula is in it. William Franklin.
William Franklin is great.
Hammer always kind of had all these great actors playing supporting parts. They could Charles Lloyd Pack, who's in lots of different Hammer films, is in it. And
But a wonderful thing about Quatermass 2, unlike Quatermass 1 and also unlike Hammer's Gothic horror films, is that because it has this like Scream and Scream Again, it has a police procedural quality to it. You know, there's a police inspector played by John Longdon who helps Quatermass in his investigation, and it's got scenes with higher ranking coppers, and it's got scenes with government officials and things like this, and it's all done in that kind of polite 1950s style that you see in any film from that period, any British film. But underneath it, in Quatermass 2, there is some real horror. There are evil things afoot. Some very nice characters come to some very horrible fates.
yes,
That if you don't see it, when you see it, it's quite nasty enough. But there are some characters, like the one played by John Ray, who just kind of walks out of shot, and then later on you find out that something absolutely horrific has happened to him. You know,
very gruesome. Yeah, there's a great scene where the police, John Longdon, I think it is, goes in to see Superior, and it turns out his Superior is an alien.
Yeah,
He's got and it's that mounting sense of paranoia, that mounting sense of
because there's
unease.
the thing that was perhaps ripped off in the American TV series of the 60s, The Invaders.
The Invaders,
A QM production.
starring Roy Finnis.
Yes. Yeah, definitely part of my youth, something that terrified me every Wednesday night on Def 2 on BBC 2. But in that series, the world was being infiltrated by aliens, and you can tell that there's something about them that you can tell that when a person is an alien. And I think in The Invaders that it's because they can't bend their little
got
fingers.
a crooked little finger.
Oh, crooked. Yeah, in Quatermass 2 they've got a little V-shaped mark because everybody who's been affected by these meteorites, when it stings you, it leaves a little V-shaped scar. And some people have got little scars on their hairlines or on one cheek or something. There's an interview online on YouTube with Vera Day, the starlet who you mentioned, who was a kind of she's a bit like Barbara Windsor.
A bit like Dinah Dawes, Thai, perky blonde, Cockney.
And she was in a lot of those kind of comedy films of the late 50s, but her career kind of came to an end because she was offered a part in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, but she turned it down. And not realising that the kind of gritty kitchen sink drama that movie represented was the coming thing, and once she missed that opportunity, she couldn't get into the others. So she called time on her acting career for 25 years or so, until she was cast by Guy Ritchie in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels.
Oh, was she in Lock, Stock? Oh, right.
Apparently, yeah.
I had no idea.
I know all this because of seeing an interview with her on YouTube, and when she was in Quatermass 2, she gets stung by one of the meteorites, so she was supposed to have a V mark appear on her face or something, but she said no. She said, "No way, darling. You're not spoiling this complexion." And she ended up getting them to put the V just under her shoulder, which no doubt justified Val Guest's slow track forward zoom towards the cleavage shots, which I think happens.
Yes, that's one of my favourite scenes.
Someone says something like, "Did you see there was something on her chest?" No doubt.
Is she still with us? Is she still alive?
I think so.
Oh, right.
I hope so.
I have no idea. I always wondered what happened to her.
She was certainly interviewed relatively recently. There's for a lot of the restored DVDs or Blu-rays that have recently come out of Hammer films, they've made various documentaries. I think the company owned by Marcus Hearn, who publishes the Reynolds and Hearn books, which we love, like English Gothic and stuff, and the Peter Cushing Companion. Peter Cushing, the authorised biography and things like that. Anyway, they made various documentaries for these Blu-rays as recently as 2012, 2013. So certainly she was alive when those were made.
Oh, excellent. Oh, I'm made up.
Yeah.
She's in Kiss of the Vampire, isn't she, I think?
Oh, is she? I've never seen that one. That's one of those...
I always wondered, she's one of those people that disappeared, and you think, well, did they just get married and
Right.
give it up or whatever. Or I didn't know. Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah.
Hello, Vera, if you're listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Vera Day. This podcast is about your movie. There aren't that many podcasts about Quatermass 2. There are some, and I'll put links to them in the show notes actually, because they're interesting listening. So yeah, and I think we'll play it later in the series, but the music by James Bernard on Quatermass 2 is fantastically memorable.
It's really powerful.
When I first saw the
really
movie when I was about 12, I think I saw it late night on Channel 4, and then I taped it, but I lost the tape or I erased it or something, and I couldn't see it again for 2 or 3 years. But I remember that music just stuck in my head, and when I eventually did see it again on the Sci-Fi Channel, I was like, oh yes, it's so eerie and vicious, the music.
It's a great, and the ending, I'm not going to give away the ending, but the ending kind of again leaves you with a sense of unease. If things aren't kind of wrapped up neatly.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a sense of, bad things could still happen.
Yeah. A wonderful film.
Yeah,
so
a great film.
Check it out. And even though it's a sequel, you don't have to see the original.
No,
it works.
Well, although do watch the original if you haven't seen it. It's
well, if you've seen
that's great as well.
If you've seen one Quatermass film, you must watch them all. And I like discovering fans who don't know that there are actually 4 Quatermass films in total, really, and you should make sure you watch them all in one form or another, because they're all great spins on the kind of concept of the alien invasion, and Quatermass 2 certainly is. Great, that's the Bag of Death for this month. And now it's time for the Bag of Death. Here is your Bag of Death, Howard.
Right. Let's have a good rummage in here. Oh, great. Island of Terror.
Oh, you're joking?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, that was one that I only recently added to the bag.
Oh, excellent.
Because I recently watched it.
Yeah, and I recently watched it on the Horror Channel. Thanks, Horror Channel.
Yes, me too. Horror Channel tend to show it in the middle of the day, which means that they can't show some of the more gruesome bits. But,
No.
So, Island of Terror. I know that we've mentioned this on the podcast. I think in the very first episode, you talked a little bit about it.
Yeah.
But now we've both seen it. Let's fill in the background a bit. I think it's 1966.
It's 1966. It's made by a production company called Planet Films, isn't it? It's
Planet
not Hammer
Film.
Films, not Amicus.
Planet Film Productions. Planet was a little rival studio that tried to do horror sci-fi movies, and like Amicus, tried to use their stars and their talent. So this film has Peter Cushing in it, and it's also directed by Terence Fisher. And it's an original screenplay, but it's kind of, although it's in colour, it's similar in tone and I guess to the Quatermass films.
Yes.
It's like a sci-fi horror B movie, and it's about. I came up with my alternative title for this film is Dave and Brian versus the Cancer Creatures, because the 2 scientists are called Dave and Brian. I can't remember what their surnames are.
No.
One of them is played by Peter Cushing. The other one's played by Edward Judd. And there's an island where an experiment to find a cure for cancer has gone terribly wrong and resulted in strange creatures roaming this island and victimising the population. And Dave and Brian get called in to go to the island and try and solve the problem, but get stuck there. And it then becomes a very claustrophobic fight for survival. I really enjoyed it.
I love it. Yeah, it's again one of those films where scientists, with the best of intentions, do something terrible. But the way it's built up is it's all set in this island. In Ireland, I think it is, isn't it? It's an Irish island.
Yeah.
And a lot of the actors in the supporting cast are Irish. People like Eddie Byrne and Niall McGuinness is in it, who was great as Carswell in Night of the Demon.
Yeah.
He plays a part in this.
And Sam Kidd's in it, since
Sam
we
Kidd,
mentioned
who was
him
Irish.
earlier.
Yeah. But a lot of the actors in supporting parts, I don't know, because they're sort of Irish actors who worked in Ireland, presumably. But yeah,
Who's the female lead?
it's Carol Gray.
Yeah. And
Who's one of those sort of like actresses who did a lot of things in the 60s, well, a few things in the 60s, and was in these sort of films, and then has sort of vanished without trace. You know, there are people like Janet Monroe, was another one, and Yvonne Monlure, who was in a couple of early Hammer films.
She's wonderfully charming and still, I believe, still very much alive.
Oh.
And you can see an interview with her on the Brides of Dracula DVD or Blu-ray, and she's, in a way, it's weird. She's, 50 years later, she's still very much Yvonne Monlure.
Yes.
And has that very charming manner and
That's
accent.
good, 'cause in the last podcast, I found out that Vera Day was still alive. Now I find out that Yvonne Monlure's still alive. That's great. It's one of the best parts of the podcast is finding out people are still alive.
And this is all thanks to Marcus Hearn and his documentary makers team. I think that the place where I saw that Vera Day was still alive was in a documentary called Hammer Glamour, which is on one of the DVDs.
Anyway, I'm pleased to hear that.
But yeah, so Carol Gray is very good, and she plays this. She's Edward Judd's girlfriend.
She's love interest, yeah. She's his
but
girlfriend.
she's also like the daughter of a rich industrialist or something. So when they say we've got to get over to this island, there's an emergency, she goes, "Well, my dad has a big helicopter, and I'm sure I could get him to lend it to us." And she kind of takes charge in that moment, and that's quite interesting. Unfortunately, she doesn't really get much to do for the rest of the film, apart from scream at stuff.
And look pretty. It's
But
interesting.
she's good.
One of the interesting things about it is it's suggested that there's a little bit of jealousy on part of Peter Cushing's character when he sees these two together.
Yeah.
And he says something about, I'll have to play solitaire or something like that.
Oh, yeah. No, there's interesting interplay.
And that's an interesting little thing which I don't usually do.
Peter Cushing is Brian, by the way. Edward Judd is Dave.
Impeccable as always, brilliant as always. Plays Dr. Brian Stanley, I think his name is, who's an expert on something. And Edward Judd is an expert on something else. And
We pay attention to these details.
I don't think it matters in this case. They're experts. They're scientists.
No, it doesn't matter in these films.
But I
Maybe
just
it
like
should,
that. I
it
like that
doesn't.
element because it's almost like Peter Cushing's in his early 50s. Then it's almost like he's not going to get the girl because he's a little bit old. It's the younger people who have the romantic interest, and the older, more middle-aged characters sort of left out. And I think that's an interesting little element to the film, which is not. It's not. They don't make a big thing of it, but it's there, and it's there in Peter Cushing's performance. A slight hint of something.
Yeah.
It's not really developed all that much all the way through it, but it's there. And I think it's those little things that give the films a little, sort of extra bit of bite,
Yeah, I agree. I think that because of moments like that, the performance is very strong throughout. Cushing's great, obviously. So is Judd. So is everybody. But they're an interesting pair of leads.
Yeah.
And because of that slight generational difference, that dynamic between them, but they obviously have a great deal of affection for each other as well. There's a bit where I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's a bit where Dave, and he's called Dr. David whatever, but there are moments where Peter Cushing calls him Dave, so he's always Dave to me. Dave has to do something horrible to Brian to save Brian's life, and he's like, "No, I can't do it. And you can see that he obviously cares for him, but Cushing insists and gets something horrible done to him, which he takes like a man, and with a great deal of style.
When I first saw this film, again, it's one of the ones I saw as a teenager, I was quite struck by that scene, how graphic it was.
Yeah.
You actually see the thing that happens. I thought, wow, for a mid-60s film, that's quite strong stuff.
Yeah,
and when
yeah.
you see the bodies that have been denuded of bone marrow, isn't it, or something?
That's a lovely use of the word denuded there, Howard.
They're all sort of like all mushy, and they're all sort of like deflated.
Yeah, well, Sam Kidd has a great line where he says something like, "There was no face, just some horrible mush with the eyes sitting in it."
Yeah.
And it's not quite as horrible. Well, it is. It's not quite as horrible as that description, but it is quite striking what you see. There are moments where there's a dissection scene, isn't there, or a post-mortem on one of the victims, and it just cuts, and you're suddenly looking at this kind of shrunken skull on a slab, just without any kind of forewarning, and it's quite alarming. I think mostly the film is just it's a decent yarn, as you said in one of the previous podcasts. The monsters are good.
Yeah, the monsters are good.
Monsters. And there's a couple of particularly nice, you don't see them, obviously, the first half of the film or so. And there's nice, gentle reveals, gradual reveals of what they are. Like you see Carol Gray's in a car, and one of them is on the roof, and you see something sliding over.
That's a brilliant moment. I saw that again. I was flicking through channels on telly, and Alan Taylor was on, and that scene was on, and it still worked. She's sitting in the car, and suddenly the thing goes down the windscreen. And it's like, what? Whoa! And they're in the field. Cushing and Edward Judd are in the field and come running across. Yeah, it's so brilliant. Terence Fisher was a master of the art of scaring people. And creating those sort of little moments, and it's interesting, because it's like interesting that Terence Fisher directs this, because most, not all, but nearly most of the films he made for Hammer were period pieces. They were Dracula films, Frankenstein films. They were set in the past. This is set in the present day, and it's set in like an ordinary, it's on this island, ordinary streets, ordinary place. It's cars and things. So you might think he's a bit out of his comfort zone, but he's actually it's really good. He directs it. He knows.
I think the island setting, and by the way, I think one of the less convincing things about the film is that it doesn't quite make you believe it is really an island. I think there's a couple of shots in the docks and things, but most of the locations are firmly landlocked looking. But I think that it's this kind of this claustrophobic environment of this small island with this kind of farming community on it. There's something quite primal about that he keys into, I think. I mean, in other movies like like probably Night of the Big Heat, which we'll talk about on another episode, he's not so comfortable with the modern tone of it.
No.
But he does do quite well in this, and he does quite well in, I think, The Earth Dies Screaming. But maybe that's because that movie is about everybody's fallen asleep, isn't it? So it's quite an eerie world.
Well, all I know is Dennis Price gets turned into a zombie.
Have you not seen it?
Has funny eyes. I think I've seen it a long time ago.
I like it though. I recommend that. And Lizzie Luchins on the music. I really enjoyed Island of Terror, apart from the music by Malcolm Lockyer.
Do you not like the music?
Not really. It's kind of... That won't get out of your head for weeks after seeing this film. He writes kind of very beautiful but raucous, sort of dramatic music.
It's very kind of insistent. Yeah, it does get in your head, doesn't it?
It could do with more, more seductive, eerie stuff, Not James Bernard, something else, I can't. But it's like it's music that you can almost enjoy, but you wish it wasn't on the film. It's a bit mismatched. But apart from that, I think it's pretty good, and it does seem to be on Horror Channel quite regularly. So
I love it. I mean, this is exactly the kind of film I really love. Again, to me, it's got the same kind of atmosphere in a way as Dr. Terror's House of Horrors.
Okay,
it's supposed to be a horror film, but I just find it really charming and quaint.
Right.
And there's a kind of old-fashioned feel to it, which is lost now. You're not going to get films like this. It's kind of you sort of know the main people are going to be all right.
Yeah.
And everybody's very reassuring.
Well, it's got that kind of blunt, lunk-headed way that kind of plot information is given away, like the opening scene in the laboratory, where the scientists say to each other things for our benefit,
yes.
like, well, we have something here that we can't test around the world, but we'll test it now and then inform the rest of the world. And by the morning, we may have the cure for cancer.
Yeah, it is that. I mean, it's clunky about people telling each other things they already know. But I think in this sort of film, that's accepted. That's okay.
I think that
because you need to get that information over.
But I mean, I do think that was kind of quite charming. I'm glad those characters didn't go on to be main characters in the film. They're killed immediately.
Yes, they are. It is. It's a romp. It's a yarn. It's just a piece of entertainment. That demands nothing more of the audience, so you just sit back and enjoy it and get caught up in it. And the monsters are great, and various people are killed off, and there's lots of action, and what more do you want?
No, I enjoyed it.
And Peter Cushing's in it.
Yeah, and he's great.
Yeah.
No, fair enough.
Always is.
I think you've sold that one, Howard. Nice work.
I think it's brilliant. I do. I really do.
Okay.
That's a favourite.
God bless.
That's what I like. What kind of thing I like? That's what I like.
I'm trying to remember who the DP is, the director of photography. Might Might be John Wilcox. Not sure. It looks nice anyway. It's
Yeah.
not nice, kind of wholesome 60s
It's got
colour.
that 60s sheen. Again, like
Yeah.
Dr. Terror and some of the
Yeah.
mid-60s Hammer films. It's got that sort of glow that those films had.
Well, there we go, folks. So if you weren't encouraged enough by Howard's enthusiasm in episode 1, go back to it now. Island of Terror. I didn't regret it, and neither will you.
No.
Hello, Lee Cushing Podcast listeners, and hello, Howard, actually, seeing as this is, I guess, a telegram to you. I hope you can tell from the oral landscape that I'm on location again, in a way. This is actually a Spanish island called Tabarca, which I've just arrived at by, I guess, by catamaran. I'm staying in Santa Pola, in the province of Valencia, where my famed and wonderful sister Maureen lives, and I'm popping out to Tabarca to visit it because it's, a marine reserve and a fascinating little island, and for some reason I just got the urge to record a little report for the Lee Cushing podcast on doing this, because I suddenly got the music from Island of Terror in my head. I'm sure that this island won't be like that. It's a beautiful looking tiny island, little community. It's a marine reserve. It's much smaller than the one in Island of Terror, and much smaller than the one in the Wicker Man, so I'm sure it will be safe. I think the whole thing will probably take me about an hour to walk around. Maybe in a little while I'll sit myself in a bar and just out of perversity produce my laptop and start to edit the next episode, or the episode that you are probably currently hearing of the Lee Cushing podcast. There's a couple of dockside builders' vehicles driving towards me, so I'll just be quiet for a moment. The water's wonderful and green here, and there are loads of feral cats. Anyway, I'm going to have a stroll. Construction vehicles, that's the word I was looking for. A couple of construction vehicles are just heading towards me along the jetty, so I'll have to be quiet for a moment. Actually, I've just realised I'm on a remote desert island, being followed around by construction machinery. It's not like Island of Terror, it's more like Killdozer. It's okay though, the pickup truck's gone now. The forklift truck's gone now, I don't think it saw me. So thanks folks, Howard, that was my dispatch from the island of Tabarca.
Yeah, great.
And
Yeah, I've never been to Spain.
Okay.
I've been to Italy, Portugal, Switzerland, and France. And
I'm
all around the British Isles and Southern Ireland, but I've never been to Spain. I'd like to.
I've never been to any of the places you mentioned apart from the British Isles and Italy, so but no, it's lovely, and that island was fascinating because there's basically nothing on it. It's a small amount of shops, all of which were closed.
What's that film where all the children go mad and start killing people? That's in Spain, isn't it? Was that in Italy?
Isn't it called Could You Kill a Child?
Yeah, something like that. With Louis Fiander.
Is Louis Fiander in it?
Yeah,
Okay.
who they said was dead, and it turns out he isn't. Although by the time this gets put online, he might be dead. I hope he isn't. I hope you're alive, Lewis.
Oh, right.
I do like your bizarre Middle European accents, but
It's a great Louis Fiander.
yeah, I've never seen that film either. But I've sort of seen bits of it on YouTube.
It's called Who Could Kill a
Who
Child?
Could Kill a Child? But it's one of those films that got about 6 different names.
Yeah, of course.
And I only mention it because that's in a way that's the Spanish horror film that I think of when more than Horror Express. Horror Express seems British, even though it's filmed in Spain and set in Russia, or whatever, just because Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee are in it. And, whereas, and it looks like a Hammer film in a way. If you ignore the fact that the voices aren't quite matching with the mouth movements. That seems like a British film. But this thing about with Louis Viander, what's it called? Could You Kill a Child?
Who Could Kill a Child?
Yeah, Who Could Kill a Child? Which I've never seen, but it's one I've read about a lot. And
yeah,
I think it's in Jonathan Rigby's book that I was reading, and there's a lot about it in there.
His book about European horror films.
It must have been that, yeah.
Yeah, because he's now written. I love his English Gothic book, which I always refer to, but he's now written books about European horror and about early Hollywood horror, kind of classic era Hollywood.
I've certainly read it somewhere. I can't remember. I've been on about this.
And Mark Gatiss is a big fan of it, and
that's it.
In his
That's what it was. It was in Mark Gatiss' documentary. That's why. That's it. I'm getting old now, so the Alzheimer's settling, and I forget it. Yeah, it was on Mark Gatiss' documentary about European horror, and he did a big thing about this film with Louis Viander, and all the children kill everybody.
Yeah,
and that just reminded me. It was all set in a Spanish town, and it just it's kind of fun that we couldn't make in Britain. In a way, it seems. I don't think we,
different
perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it could, but...
well, I think that Tom Shankland's The Children is an attempt to do that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, but not quite. And the children go mad and kill people simply because they've been so abused by the adults. That's why,
right.
They have to just go.
Well, why do you think that we couldn't make a film like that?
I don't know, perhaps we could, I don't know, it just seems... Perhaps we could then. I don't know, killing a child is still...
taboo.
A taboo, and very, very, quite right. And certainly when that film was made, what was it made by 1975, 74, 76?
Around that.
We in this country were making things like The Ghoul and Captain Kronos, and we were still in that sort of area of horror filmmaking. And there is a film, I suppose, called, which I have seen, I wish I hadn't, called I Don't Want to Be Born with Joan Collins. Have you seen that one? She gives birth to a complete Exorcist rip-off.
I haven't seen it, no, I avoided it. It's not British, is it?
Yeah, it is British.
It is British,
yeah.
Oh dear.
Joan Collins and Donald Pleasance,
right.
amongst others. And that's got a sort of evil baby in it, but it's not...
Well, I think the thing about sort of evil children horror films is that because of possibly subconscious worries about harming children on screen.
Yes, I think that's...
The evil child always wins.
Yes.
And therefore, because it's alright for children to kill adults on screen, that's fine. So these films are quite predictable. And I think The Omen gets away with it because nobody expects the evil kid to kill Gregory Peck.
No.
But which he doesn't directly, but he does win.
No, I think that The Omen gets away with it simply because Damien doesn't actually kill anybody. Physically.
No.
The devil, whatever, causes all these terrible accidents, I suppose accidents to happen, everyone's head being cut off and all that. And that's alright, it's not the child actually doing it. The image of a child killing somebody, just as directly as that, is sort of, I think it would be quite difficult to do in a way, in a sensitive way. I don't know, I haven't seen this Spanish film, so I don't know how they do it. I get the feeling that you, in a way, sympathise with the children simply because the children have been abused by the adults and have been ill-treated, and it's all about what we're doing with the world, and we're bringing children into this world which is so full of conflict, and even things haven't changed at all, so full of conflict, so full of warfare, so full of violence, so full of upheaval and political conflict, all that sort of thing, that why should they turn on us?
Yeah.
We're messing up their world for them, the world they're going to grow up into. So why adults are asking for it, in a way. I think that's how that film is sort of presented. And I don't think we'd have the guts to quite do that. I think British horror films are still quite conservative at that time. And The Children, the film you mentioned, which I saw a couple of years ago, is different in the sense that they are evil children. They are just, sort of starry-eyed, sinister, evil children.
And there's no real explanation.
And there's no explanation, and there's no kind of political context for it, or anything that might explain it. They are just... And that always makes you slightly uncomfortable, because children aren't evil. Children are innocent, and it's adults who do all the bad stuff. And so the idea of evil children, I don't know, always makes me slightly uncomfortable. I love The Omen. I do like that because that's just schlock. But
it's always a bit uncomfortable when it seems to be kind of adults, and the filmmakers are obviously adults, kind of blaming evil on children.
Yes, I think it's the idea that somehow people are born evil, which I just don't, agree with at all. I don't know. Well, evil is a powerful word anyway. Are people evil? Are people just do act out of extreme self-interest?
Oh yeah, of course. It's that's a whole other can of worms. I do think, without going into something that we might, I don't think this film's in the Bag of Death because you haven't seen it. But
no,
the
I haven't
Hammer
seen
film,
it.
well, no, not this film, but the Hammer film to the Devil a Daughter is a good kind of response to that kind of thing, actually, because although it's kind of ripping off The Omen and The Exorcist, certainly The Exorcist, the child in it, Nastasia Kinski, is more kind of being manipulated by adults. It's not an evil child film in that sense, and it is a kind of, I think, quite a powerful kind of spiritual thriller about the frightening lengths that people go to when they believe something satanic, or they feel that they're enthralled to Satan in some way. So that's one that I recommend, and it's always kind of in the back of my mind. It's not the best film ever, but it did make an impression on me when I first saw it.
I saw it a long time ago. Doesn't Dan Elliott catch fire? No, somebody catches fire.
It's Anthony Valentine. Yeah, fire. It's the first thing I ever saw Anthony Valentine in.
Oh, right.
I'm a huge fan of Anthony Valentine. He's one of the great villainous actors of TV, I think.
Yes. Also, a quick word, I didn't mention it in the last podcast, talking about great villainous actors. The actor John Carson died, actually quite a few months ago, before Christmas.
Oh, yes.
And he was 89, so he had a good innings. But he was a favourite actor of mine. He's been Plague of the Zombies and Taste of Dracula and Captain Kronos, yes. And a rather very neat little science fiction film, very good film called Invasion. No, The Nightcrawler. Yes, with Maurice Denham. And that's, if you get a chance to see that film, that's a good one. I think it's on YouTube, so
I've seen
he's in that. And he's in the Avengers and all these sort of things, playing velvet-voiced bad guys, and
also he was one of the voices on Thunderbird.
Yes. Somebody went to Jerry Anderson apparently and said, "How the hell did you get James Mason to do voice this?" And I've seen an interview with John Carson. He said, "Yes, I have this. I did quite well because I had this accidental," he said, resemblance vocally to James Mason, and so I was able to do a lot of voiceover and things like that and make a very nice living out of that. So he died. So I just wanted to pay my tribute to him. Because he's great in everything.
Yes, died peacefully at his home, which I believe was in South Africa.
Yes, he lived in South Africa. He went back to South Africa when apartheid was.
Was he South African?
I think he was born in South Africa and came over here when he was very young to go to university. One of those people sort of drifted into acting kind of accidentally, wanted to do something else, wanted to be a lawyer, and then sort of just went to see some plays and got involved, and people said he was good, he was good, and then just sort of went on from there, so.
Right.
Yeah, one of my favourites anyway, and another one gone.
Yes.
Another one.
Oh well. Many left. Let's not get on that.
No, we're not going to get morbid. No, still lots alive.
Well, that's a note to end on. Sorry for the random grab bag clip show nature of this episode. Hope you found something to enjoy, and if you did, there are a few more similar short chats between Howard and I about British horror films on the Ambidextrous Solutions Limited YouTube channel. And I'd just like to say thank you, Maureen, because if it wasn't for her influence on me, I wouldn't be here doing this, and you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. So, if you've enjoyed anything we've put out on this podcast, you owe her your thanks too. Please spare a moment for Maureen in your thoughts, and her husband, Richard. She was too young, and a lot of people's lives would be less fun and less bright without her around. But the show must go on. Our episode about Bram Stoker's Dracula will hopefully be up in the next few days, and next week Ian, myself, and our returning guest, Tim Shaw, will record a chat about 1973's ghostly chiller, The Legend of Hell House. Appropriately, a film that so terrified Maureen that she would talk about it in hushed, awe-struck tones. Let's see if it holds up. Thanks, listeners. Till next time.
You have been listening to And Now the Podcast Starts. Produced and released by Ambidextrous Solutions Limited. Presented by T.D. Velasquez and Howard Whittock. Special thanks to Greg Hume for our original theme music and to Brian Gorman for our original artwork. All dialogue and music clips from films, TV shows, and trailers are used for the purposes of criticism in the spirit of fair dealing as defined in UK law and fair use as defined in US law. No copyright infringement is intended. Please visit our home on the web, www.andnowpodcast.com, for more content and contact details. Or visit our Facebook pages at AndNowPod or at Lee Cushing Pod. Follow us on Twitter at AndNowPodcast or at Lee Cushing Podcast. If you'd like to donate to us, please visit patreon.com/AndNowPodcast. And now the podcast stops.